Hi, I'm Natalie Kane, and I'm the Principal Investigator of Preserving and Sharing Born Digital and Hybrid Objects from and across the National Collection, which is an AHRC-funded project from the Towards a National Collection Foundation project set. Introducing my co-presenter.
Hello, I'm Stephen McConnachie from the BFI National Archive, and I was co-investigator on that project, and my job title is Head of Data and Digital Preservation at the BFI.
Next slide, please. The project was led by the Victoria and Albert Museum and the V&A in collaboration with the BFI and Birkbeck University of London. As I mentioned, I'm the principal investigator. My co-investigators were Dr. Joel McKim, who's at Birkbeck, Stephen McConnachie at British Film Institute, and Richard Palmer, who's the V&A, and he was a technical co-lead. We also had our research fellow, Dr. Gabby Aragoni, with development and preservation expertise from Tom Ensom, who's a freelance digital conservation expert, also at Tate. It was funded by the HSC, as I mentioned, and the project really was to enable expertise to be disseminated across the sector, particularly in terms of born digital and hybrid objects. And this is different to digitized collections. So this is those who have museum status and object status within collections. We did keep away from archives and libraries in particular, but we'll kind of go a bit more about what the scope of those objects were a little bit later. Next slide, please. So the key aims were to lay the foundations of future research and develop strategic priorities, to build understanding of the principles, standards, system, procedures, and literacy required to collect the born digital, and to build confidence and capacity across the sector. Again, this is very much guidance across all collecting and memory institutions to enable people to really get stuck in and collect born digital objects who want. And we know that these are quite small and often underdeveloped collections because a lot of the capacity tends to go around digitizing object sets. And we really wanted to kind of see and to kind of understand what the specific challenges were around collecting born digital objects, anything from kind of app-based games to architectural kind of PDFs and that kind of objects set. But again, we'll go into a bit more data when you look at the kind of case studies that we chose as our initial kind of consultation. Next slide, please. So the key outputs were a set of case studies on born digital and hybrid objects, a report outlining recommendations for future research and policy for the sector, a decision model for community investigation, and a data model to propose development and expansion of existing cataloguing standards for born digital and hybrid objects. In this talk, I'm just going to go a little bit of an overview of what the report outlining those recommendations were. And Stephen's going to talk a bit more in detail about the decision model. We're not going to talk too much on the data model, but you can find more information about it on the V&A Preserving and Sharing Born Digital website. I will put a link in a bit later into the chat. I've just realized there is not a chat, but we will put more information into the panel. So the case studies were generated from a period of literature review that the team underwent in order to understand what kind of objects and what kind of breadth was necessary in order for us to understand what kind of issues and what kind of challenges that we really needed to address, which are the 4 objects that are here. We then went through a series of workshops which covered digital preservation, collection management, and access and display to understand kind of what processes these kind of objects would need to go through in order to understand what their particular challenges would be. We had a series of expert interviews with anyone from industry, because obviously industry is a big often can be quite a big hurdle in these kind of acquisitions because of the nature of their creation. We also kind of involved legal teams as well to understand what the legal problems might be, as well as sector experts and those within the museum field. These case studies were In the Eyes of the Animal by Marshmallow Laser Feast. This is a VR work, which as well as being kind of a VR work that would be acquired by the BFI, this was an experimental acquisition for the team. But it also has this hybrid capacity to it as well. So it tested the ideas of what kind of collection would mean for that institution, which has a particular collection policy around these types of objects. Geist XYZ by Zeitgeist, which is a object which is created entirely using computer-generated imagery, but itself has multiple parts, from a website to 3D data to text-based elements, and also has a vinyl as well as part of the acquisition. We also have YStop, which is by Stopwatch, and is a community-based app that's created to help record and get people record police incidents, but also to give people their rights back, but has a lot of kind of understanding about what digital preservation means when a community is involved in the creation process. And then we had a more speculative case study, which was Instagram by Meta, which looks at the idea of boundlessness and the problems of networked objects when you're trying to acquire them as an institution. And this very much was to test a lot of those issues around what would it be for essentially someone like the V&A to acquire something like Instagram, based on the issues we have around our collections policies, deed of gift, all sorts of processes that we currently have in place, and what would be needed for that to be expanded. Next slide. This generated the report in June 2020, and we had a webinar to talk a bit more in detail about some of those issues, which you can find online, and also introduce the decision model that you're going to see today. Next slide. Just to talk very briefly about some of the issues that came up with some of the things out of that report, just before we could kind of go into the decision model itself. So born digital and hybrid objects, as we understand them, are often multi-part acquisitions, and so therefore they can have anything, they often aren't just one thing, not like, we'll see something like a chair, for instance, which might be a bit more clear cut. They can often come with multiple kind of data sets, they can come with multiple hierarchies of information, for instance, and that's something that you have to kind of think about when it comes to the acquisition process. They often have a reliance on networks and infrastructures. That can cause a huge problem for acquisition. Mutability is another concern. Context, process, and documentation is something that we often came up in conversation quite a lot in terms of the report itself. So the idea of process and how you record that, and how that often becomes quite important in the understanding of the core work itself. And then the core versus the auxiliary item. So how much does the core object itself distinguish itself from the auxiliary items that exist? And this actually became quite fundamental when we went to have a look at the data model. When again, we're not talking about this today, but we're happy to have discussions about that at a later date, maybe in the future, if in terms of looking at that model another time beyond this conference. But the idea of the auxiliary item also came into discussion in other stages as well. Next slide. And then new challenges that came out of this were things like new stakeholders that often we knew that they existed, but they become much more into play. We look at things like, for instance, Annette Decker talks a lot about the idea of networks of care, and individuals who are looking at legacy technologies and looking after legacy technologies themselves, particularly kind of old tech, or what's often called old tech, but who's actually looking looking after these technologies right now, and how we kind of bring them into museums, and how do we get them to work with us, particularly at the point of creation, and then onwards. How do we museums change our structures in order for us to create kind of communities of preservation ultimately? There's a lot of legacy challenges and IPR challenges, particularly in terms of big tech heritage, and the challenges that we have in terms of industry and the gatekeeping of knowledge that occurs there. Authorship and ownership, so we have issues around provenance and distributed ownership. So for instance, how many people can sign the deed of gift and who can, and then corporate structures that may cause problems around that. And then challenges to traditional collections and preservation models. So there is a possibility there could be possibilities for things like collaborative stewardship between institutions that may enable different forms of preservation models or different collections management models as well. Next slide. And that takes us on to our decision model. So that's where we were in terms of our report. And then from that, we decided to pull on and create these decision models. So I'll hand over to Stephen now.
Thanks, Natalie. So I'll go through fairly briefly and talk through some examples and some ambitions and limitations. So why did we create it? So we wanted to create a structured version of the amazing insights that came out of the workshops. So we attempted to codify decision-making processes, and really the driver for it was to create a traversable system that professionals in a collections organisation across roles in a collections organisation could make use of when they were assessing complex hybrid born digital candidates for acquisition. So that was our ambition. We decided to model categories because we felt that was one of the key findings from the workshops, was how these problems may be solvable within categories. And I won't go through them in detail, but you can see them there. We broke down technical constraints into multiple subcategories because it's a very big area in this project. And then we dealt with some of the, what you might call overarching or institutional context, like collecting policy. And then finally, data protection and intellectual IPR. They all came out of the workshops as critical factors for consideration. So we worked on the model as a visualization using flowchart technologies and frameworks. Some of you may be familiar with BPMN, Business Process Modeling Notation. We referred to that, and we created these entities visually coded to indicate what they're about. And they're typically what you would see in a BPMN or other process flowchart. And probably two to draw your attention to are the flags: elevated risk and critical issue. During the modelling, we identified points in the decision making where those flags were very interesting, potentially useful to insert. So you'll see that in the example, which I'll show you now. I won't go through all of the detailed modelling because you can find it on the published report. I just took one example to show you how it looks and how it might operate as a kind of decision flow assessment process. You can see this one has two flags, one for elevated risk and one for critical issue. And I'll talk a bit in a second about some of the objective and subjective problems with those flags, but we felt they were useful to model nonetheless. This is probably the simplest of all the traversable graphs, the IPR. Some limitations in the work. We modeled a linear decision-making. In reality, the decision-making won't be as neat. Maybe cyclical, maybe interrupted, certainly not as straightforward as the visuals make it look. The broad range of object types has been made simplified for the point of modeling. Really, you could have a single model for every type of object, a single model for each domain. We're modeling binary decisions where reality is likely to have much higher uncertainty levels. Yes and no may be very difficult to arrive at. Maybe a maybe requires investigation and nuance. So the flags, elevated risk and critical issue, we felt these were extremely useful to insert because fundamentally they point at risk and tolerance to risk, and especially tolerance to risk in an institution which is designed to keep objects safe forever. But these are subjective, and we discovered from feedback they're likely to be specific to each institution where tolerances live. The final thing is quite a big thing, the depth and complexity versus legibility and usability. We tried to make a very, very big complex subject into quite a neat visualization, and that in real world usefulness is likely to require specific adaptations for specific types of object, I think. So next steps to finish. The model is available for the community to adapt and repurpose as desired, and potentially, as I've suggested, a useful thing maybe to take the model and break it down into specific types and create an equivalent for different types. And just to flag, the VNAR hoping to use the model within some real world collecting work quite soon. So it should be a good test of how useful it is. So that's it from me. I'll just hand back to Natalie to summarize.
Yeah, so again, this work is very much, we just reached the end of the project. The project has now finished. we're hoping to kind of, again, as Stephen said, this is very much a model that we hope the community will pick up and use and adapt. This is never meant to be kind of a finite or finished model set in stone. We understand that this, again, is not meant for kind of every and all kind of final objects in that sense. So we would really like to kind of invite the community to pick up and adapt and to play with and to get back essentially to us on their feedback. So you can find it in the report on the V&A Preserving and Sharing Bond Digital website, and you can search it quite easily on the V&A website. When we come to the discussion, we will put the link in the chat so that you can have a look at it there as well. We're always kind of interested into hearing how things like this do develop and whether they will work for the types of organisation, because we have tried to keep it at a level where it is able to be adapted by different types of people. One of the things that I think is quite interesting for us to know is the importance of kind of who is in the room and how we're able to adapt it to ensure that things like curatorial input is kind of is important into this kind of decision making. Because we did notice that the idea of kind of curatorial decision making was quite useful in terms of preservation, so curatorial collections management and preservation expertise all being kind of collective together during the preservation process is quite an important conversation that came out of the report. So I think that we invite people to collaborate with us and to give us feedback in the future, and we hope this be taken forward. Thank you for listening.